We wanted to reawaken garments in our permanent collection through the senses. So when a garment enters the Met's collection, its status is changed irrevocably. It can't be worn anymore, it can't be smelt, it can't be heard, it can't be touched.
I'm William Van Meter, and this is The Art Angle, a podcast from ArtNet News. There is a lot to unpack in the Met's new Costume Institute show, Sleeping Beauties, which opens on Friday, May 10th. It's about nature and the cycle of life, and as it turns out, there's a lot about death. It also touches upon chemistry, biology, mythology, and so much more, all told through fashion. Added to this litany of themes, the show also tells the story of the Met and the goings-on behind the scenes. It's about how archived garments are preserved and how they are disintegrating. It's not just about clothes, but about how they were worn and who wore them. It tells the story of us. It's a visceral exhibition of over 400 years of fashion that engages the senses. It can be a heady experience. There are the sounds of waves crashing, and birds calling, and poems being read aloud. There is textured wallpaper you can touch, and courtesy of the German artist Sissel Tollas, wallpaper you can scratch and sniff and tubes you can snort. Frankly, this portion of the exhibit kicks like a mule and is unforgettable, with scent being such a powerfully triggering memory force. Sleeping Beauties was curated by this week's guest, Andrew Bolton, the head curator of the Anna Wintour Costume Center at the Met, who previously helmed such blockbusters as Alexander McQueen's Savage Beauty, China Through the Looking Glass, and Heavenly Bodies, Fashion and the Catholic Imagination, which were some of the most visited exhibitions in the museum's entire history. Today's fashion exhibit-heavy museum landscape has a lot to do with Bolton's successes, but with his trained anthropologist's eye, he never fails to zero in on the intellectual and human connotations in the garments. Hi, Andrew. Thanks so much for joining us on The Art Angle.
Oh, thank you for having me.
So first of all, I just wanted to jump into the theme for the show is pretty complex this year. If you could just describe that for us, what's your elevator pitch for it?
Yeah, oh my gosh, it's a bit more of a phrase elevator pitch. So it's a show that's based on our permanent collection. So we haven't done an exhibition since about time, Fashion and Duration, which was 2020, I think, in which the whole exhibition was based on our collection. We wanted to reawaken garments in our permanent collection through the senses. So when a garment enters the Met's collection, its status is changed irrevocably. It can't be worn anymore, it can't be smelt, it can't be heard, it can't be touched. The only sense you're left with really is the sense of sight. And that's actually enhanced in terms of the fact that we were able to focus on techniques and on embellishments, on the construction, but all the other senses are compromised. So the idea for the exhibition was to somehow bring back those senses and bring back the sensorial qualities of dress, and also to bring back our sensorial experiences of dress.
It's interesting that you say that because that means it also kind of tells the story of the museum as well and of what the Costume Institute is, looking at these artifacts and that they are locked away and that they aren't closed anymore. And I think that a lot of what this show does is makes you analyze these things and analyze how they are closed and how they do move, and like you use all this technology. So that's why I wanted you to explain the theme, because it's so complex, because it touches upon nature, but it also touches upon mythology and technology, and there's birds and there's fish, and it's very, very complicated. And I think, of course it's fashion, it's going to be beautiful, but fashion doesn't always have to be beautiful. And I think that, you really do pick a lot of things that are aesthetically very, very pleasing. It's kind of a breathtaking assemblage.
Oh, thank you. You're right, is what you said earlier, in terms of the status of clothing. They become artworks in a way, like lifeless artworks in a way. And the intentionality behind the object is muted in a way. How I started off the exhibition, I had the idea of reawakening garments in the collection. And initially, I was gravitating towards sort of masterpieces, so pieces that I love and that I've always wanted to see reawakened. We have a mantua from the 1770s with a side pannier that measures almost 7 feet wide. So the idea of how women actually navigated space in the 18th century and having to go through a doorway sideways. I always wanted to sort of resurrect something like that. But as I began to sort of look at the storyboard, there was no connection beyond the fact that they were just incredible objects. There was no connection. And I was really struck by how many garments we have in our collection that are inspired by the natural environment. And the more I thought about it, the more I thought, gosh, nature actually is the ultimate metaphor for fashion in terms of its rebirth and its renewal, the cycles of fashion, the cycles of nature, but also ideas of ephemerality, ideas of impermanence and transience. So I felt that this idea of the ephemerality of fashion was mirrored in nature, because part of the exhibition was focusing on garments that are so fragile that they can no longer be displayed on a mannequin. They have to be laid flat in cases because they have something called inherent vice. It's such a great term. An inherent vice is a quality that's intrinsic to a garment that in a way is the very cause of its ruin. It's almost like a form of self-destruction. I felt that nature sort of tapped into this idea of this ephemerality and this impermanence.
Inherent vice, it sounds like an action movie.
It does, I know. Yeah.
I was also struck that there's garments that look like flowers or some that reference fish and a lot of insects, but there's also clothes that incorporate the natural world. Like, for instance, like the Simon Costin necklaces that use rabbit skulls and bird talons. So I found that fascinating. That's also a designer I hadn't heard of before.
Yeah, Simon Costin, that's one of my favorite pieces in the show. We have two pieces by Simon. The one you're referring to is called the Memento Mori necklace, which we had in the collection since a show I did called Anglomania, which I think is 2005. And we collected it for that exhibition. And as you say, it's made out of turkey claws and we have rabbit skulls. And it has an inherent vice in terms of the fact that it has something called jet disease, which is an inherent vice. One piece I always wanted from Simon was a neck piece called The Nightingale and the Rose that was inspired by Oscar Wilde's short story, a tragic story about a nightingale committing suicide to get a red rose for a student to give to his sort of girlfriend. She was a very capricious girlfriend. A rose wasn't enough eventually, but it's a tragic story. And Simon created this wonderful neckpiece, which is made out of brass thorns with a taxidermy nightingale in the middle of it, almost as if it's crucified on the brass thorns. And in that particular case, we're calling them all case studies. And that particular one is called The Nightingale and the Rose. That's in the middle of the gallery. And it's surrounded by a sort of horror show of hats that incorporated taxidermy birds from the late 19th century through to the mid 20th century. And birds have been very inspiring for fashion, but at the same time, they've also been one of its casualties. And it's like an amphitheater of these sad, poor birds that have been sort of sacrificed for fashion. And we've x-rayed them. So you see the bones and you see the beaks and you see the eyes. It's just so poetic walking into a space, seeing this necklace. And then we have Elizabeth Debicki actually reading Oscar Wilde's short story in the gallery. So it's very melancholic, the exhibition, I have to say, when you walk through it. And I think nature is melancholic.
It is, it's beautiful, but it's also cruel and, it's nature.
Absolutely. And I think that underlies many of the case studies. There's another case study, which is just before you get to Simon's Nightingale and the Rose, in which we have a jacket by Alexander McQueen from his Birds collection. And that collection was directly inspired by Hitchcock's The Birds. McQueen loved that film. And in that particular gallery, we want to sort of capture the sort of fear that film really did sort of portray with the idea of the sound and the birds flying around. So in the middle, we have Alexander McQueen's jacket. And on this dome ceiling above, we have swallows flying around. You start off by having 1, 2, 3, 4, and then suddenly the whole dome is filled with birds. And we were able to find the original soundtrack from Hitchcock's movie, The Birds, in an archive in Berlin. So when you walk into the space, you're actually hearing the soundtrack from Hitchcock's The Birds.
Wow. That must have been a hard hunt to find the original soundtrack in Berlin. Tell me about that journey.
He talks about it in a series of interviews. So we were able to trace it back to Berlin. But what's fascinating is the fact that he recorded birds flapping, but he also almost an early form of digitization. It's sort of enhanced and there's one flap and it's an extraordinary sort of melange of technology that was really ahead of its time in that period. So it seems a little antiquated now when you walk in because of where we are with technology, but it still has that sense. If you close your eyes, you feel you're in the movie. You feel that one moment where the sparrows come down the chimney in the farmhouse. And that's really what you feel when you're in there. So part of the idea for the exhibition is to play with multi-senses so that in one gallery, you're able to experience smell and sound and touch and also obviously sight. Sometimes it's exclusively one, but in many instances, there's a conflation of different senses.
Speaking of McQueen, I think there was a lot of standout striking dresses in the show from McQueen, but also from Sarah Burton's tenure. which I think that, even though she kind of just finished that, a lot of people equate Lee McQueen's period as like the high art moment when she's really done such amazing things. And so it was really cool that so much of her stuff is in this show.
It's extraordinary. Sarah wasn't as dark as Lee. There was a darkness to Lee that came across in his clothes very powerfully. That was part of his brilliance, is that he was able to affect and evince these visceral emotions from you. Sarah is much softer. She shares the same interests as Lee. Nature was a huge part of Lee's work, as it is with Sarah's. So there are themes, but how she approaches it is gentler, not as dark, but the craftsmanship is absolutely extraordinary. So I think that's what's amazing about Sarah and her time at McQueen. She was able to embrace the house codes because she trained with Lee, but also move it forwards and create her own vocabulary and her own house codes. She's an extraordinary designer.
I've never been able to put my finger on it, but I think you are correct that there is like this sense of the life affirming in the work that she's done, with like that butterfly dress that you show and stuff. That's something that he would never do, but it is with the same language.
Yes, Lee made it out of moths that were sort of like deteriorating, and the wings were falling off. Sarah did it as a joyous celebration of nature. And that's a good example that you mentioned, because that particular piece, it's extraordinary. It's actually dyed turkey feathers that have been cut, dyed, hand painted, and then applied to a structure, but to look like monarch butterflies. It really is extraordinary. It was worn by Elizabeth Banks in the Hunger Games.
Oh, wow. Cool. There's such a mix of designers. There's huge houses like Dior and Chanel, but there's also so many designers I've never heard of that I learned about from this show that I'm excited to do a deeper dive and learn more about. Can you tell me about this assemblage of huge household names and these like much smaller, undiscovered creators?
We used the show as an opportunity to also add pieces to our collection. So we actually acquired 80 new acquisitions for our permanent collection, but also for the exhibition. And one of our strategies is to collect more diverse designers who are just emerging, and designers who are also engaging in more ethical and environmental practices. So we've collected our first piece by Phoebe English, who is a designer who works a lot with natural dyes, with recycled materials. The same with Paolo Kazana. There's a great dress by Olivia Cheng that's actually covered in jewel beetles from Thailand, from a sustainable farm in Thailand. So we wanted to use the exhibition, because of its connection to nature, as an opportunity to highlight some of these designers who are working with these ethical practices. Botter, Richard Malone. Richard Malone works with a fabric that is recycled from plastic found in the oceans, from fishing nets and plastic bottles found on riverbeds. I didn't want to separate it. I didn't want to say this is a garment that is embroidered with algae sequins. So it was really important to me that they were integrated throughout the rest of the exhibition, because I wanted to sort of really, in a way, articulate that this is a way of life now. The fact that this is part of our culture. We have to think ethically. We have to think sustainably. It seems strange to ghettoize it in one area. It was important for me to sort of like integrate it throughout, because it's really part of our life now.
Another theme that I saw, that it's about centuries communicating with each other. You have stuff that is from spring, summer 2024, and then there's items that I glance at and I think, oh, that's like a Christian Lacroix jacket from the 1980s, but it's really from the 17th century. And that it kind of shows like the commonalities and how not just trends carry over, but ideas, and how we just keep repeating ourselves, and just the story of us. And if you can talk about that for a moment.
Again, it was important to us. Part of that was to focus on fashion cycles, the idea of the cyclicity of fashion, but also the cyclicity of nature. We're reawakening garments, through touch, through smell, through hearing, through movement in some cases. But another way that we're also reawakening garments is through interpretation, and through juxtaposing a historical garment with a contemporary garment that's been inspired by it, sometimes directly. You mentioned the small jacket that looks like it's Christian Lacroix, and it's actually from the early 17th century. And Karl Lagerfeld for Chanel did a dress that was directly inspired by the embroidery of that particular jacket. So having them side by side, it's another way of reawakening the historical garment. In a way, we've always tried to do that in our exhibitions, where we juxtapose historical and contemporary pieces. There's a sort of odd energy that when you look at them, it's almost as if the historical piece informs the contemporary piece enlivens the historical piece. But there is this sort of like almost electrical current when you see them together. And it's also a way of younger visitors who may be unfamiliar with the early material. It gives an access into history in a way. So yeah, it was part of the strategy. One of the reawakenings is reawakening conceptually and through interpretation.
There's a lot of florals in the show. And, obviously Floral is something with dresses and fashion that is perennial and will go on forever. It must have been hard to narrow down what you showed. What were your criteria for that?
Part of it was just recurring motifs in our collection. But also, I wanted to focus on the symbolism of flowers and the changing symbolism of flowers. So I chose a poppy. We have some extraordinary examples of designers engaging with the poppy. But, the poppy as a symbol has often been associated, really since sort of classical times, the idea of death and mortality, blood. And there's one particular dress by Paquin. It is extraordinary. It's printed with these tiny poppies that look like drops of blood. And then we have these appliques at the chest and the hem that look like they're almost blood clots. It's a beautiful dress, but what's extraordinary about it is that it was made just before the outbreak of the Second World War. So it has this sort of like very prophetic feel to it. So in that particular gallery, we commissioned Nick Knight, the artist, to do this poppy that's slowly bleeding over a period of time. Then we have Morgan Spector that is reading the famous poem In Flanders Fields, which is all about the death of warriors during the death of soldiers in the First World War. So a lot of it was trying to pick up on the symbolism and sometimes the contradictory symbolism of flowers. The rose is another example. We start off that whole section with Gertrude Stein's, the tautological line of roses, the roses, the roses, the rose. And I love that because it's almost as if by saying, repeating it again and again and again, she manifests the rose. So in that particular case, the rose is about life and fertility and sexuality and romance, but it's also about death. So in that gallery, we have 3 examples of living rose dresses. And then we have one of our Sleeping Beauties, which is a dress by Lanvin, that the tulle is so fragile, it's lying flat. And we brought that back to life by smell. So we work with an incredible artist called Sissel Tollas, who has an apparatus that is able to collect the smell molecules of garments and recreate them. You think you're going to smell roses, you're not. You're smelling the olfactory history of this garment, the wearer, the fragrance she wore, her natural body odors, what she ate, what she drank, what she smoked, and also where that dress has been, the environment it's been in. So you're smelling the life history of an object. So the rose was about life and death, but it's also a nice way to talk about these bigger ideas of living objects.
Does that mean like they're actually kind of like piped into the room so like the person can smell?
Absolutely. It's optional. It's optional.
Okay.
So if you want to smell the perfume and sweat of Denise Poirier, who wore one of the dresses, you don't need to. But there's 4 rooms, I would say, where we focus on scent. And there's different display methodologies in which you can experience it. One of the most fun ones is the actual wall. So we have a wall where we have nano paint with the smell of 3 particular dresses. So if you rub your hand on the paint, it activates the scent. It's a very intimate and very personal exhibition, but it's also very participatory. We deliberately showed some garments lower on the ground, so people have to bend down, or children can appreciate them more. People of different heights can appreciate them more. Again, going back to the bodice you mentioned, the 17th century bodice, it has a sort of embroidery in the 17th century was 3-dimensional, but it was also dynamic. So when you look at it, you can see strawberries ripen, and you can see pea pods burst open with peas, and you can see birds snatching at dragonflies and caterpillars. So we've animated that. So in that particular room, you look up and there's a big dome where the embroidery is projected onto the dome, and you see very slowly these animals and insects moving. But at the same time, you've also created a touch wallpaper. So we, again, 3D scanned the jacket, and then we created this wallpaper, but to the specifications of Braille. So you can actually feel it. And the height of the embossment is the specifications of Braille. So it is a very participatory exhibition.
These are pretty profound strains intertwined in this. Was this always from the beginning that you had this life and death, this kind of grand crescendos and symphony of life was within this theme, or did this kind of develop as you were assembling this?
I think it became more consolidated. It was always there. And I think overlaying it with nature, and nature being the through line, made it more melancholic in a way because of, how we discussed it's like these ideas of life and death and renewal and rebirth. So that added another layer to these very profound themes that we're dealing with in the exhibition. So you walk into the one room, which is called the garden. And again, we have another sort of literally dying in front of your eyes. It's a coat that was made by Jonathan Anderson for Loewe. And it's a coat where he had planted seeds into it, oat grass, chia seeds. and they grow over a period of a month and then they die. So that's an object that literally dies in front of your eyes. McQueen would love this exhibition, I'm sure, because there's so much darkness to it, but it's also incredibly light. But yeah, I suppose it's a very complex exhibition.
So the garments are within the Met's permanent collection. Where is that? Where does that live or remain in stasis?
Yeah, the majority of it lives in the building, actually just 3 doors down from where I am at the moment, in an environmentally controlled, temperature controlled, humidity controlled, light controlled environment. That's where our sleeping beauties usually sleep. But it was interesting. I was looking at one particular garment. It's actually an extraordinary dress by Christian Dior called Venus, that since we acquired it in 1953, I believe, it's had 9 lives. It's been like a cat. It's been in 9 different exhibitions and 9 different interpretations. But for the rest of the time, it sleeps in a drawer, in tissue paper that's also covered with a linen wrap. In a way, you think about how the reason why it will remain forever beautiful and forever young, because it won't age. We're keeping it sort of, in a way, alive just by caring for it. So there is that aspect of what we do. The big aspect is the preservation and conservation of the garments in our care, but also our responsibility is also to show them to the public and to reinterpret them for the public.
And you mentioned that you acquired new things for the show and for the permanent collection. Were there any designers that you learned about or anything that you discovered in the archives? You've been there for many years, but I assume the archives are quite massive.
Yeah, there was a couple of things that you may have seen in the catalogue. There's 2 garments. I included a garment by Dracol in a show I did called About Time 3 years ago. And I looked at it again, mainly because of its motifs. Before it was about the silhouette. It had a particular silhouette from 1912, very specific silhouette with these conflated panniers. But this time I was looking at it through the iconography, and what I discovered was a small, almost a sachet at the chest, almost like potpourri, when you see those sort of potpourri sachets in your linen drawers. And so it was a small sachet that she had just at her chest that she obviously had put in roses and different sorts of flowers. And I hadn't seen that before. I was focusing on the silhouette so much that I hadn't actually looked inside to see this sachet. And Sissel, again, the smell artist, did a molecular reading and then recreated the smell of that potpourri. So that came as something new to me. A designer who I discovered and wasn't very familiar with when I was working on the show is a designer based in Japan called Ryunosuke Okazaki. And he's mainly a sculptor by training, but he does these extraordinary wearable sculptures that look like bird exoskeletons. And they're very complex to create. And he actually came over from Japan to actually create it because it involves a lot of almost like whale bones that you insert into the dress to give it this sort of movement. So he was somebody whose work I wasn't so familiar with and learned more about during the process. And he's somebody who is absolutely extraordinary. His work is so poetic and straddles, I'm not a great fan of making an art and fashion divide, but he is somebody who conflates those categories.
Interesting. And, correct me if I'm wrong, but, you didn't study fashion, did you? Like you studied non-Western art.
That's right. Yeah, I began at least my studies as an anthropologist, an art historian, but non-Western art. And I always loved fashion growing up. But my connection to fashion was more street style. I was a bit too young, but I was lucky enough through magazines to experience the sort of punks from the 70s and new romantics from the 80s. I came of age, I suppose, in the mid to late 80s when New Romantic was just sort of like boiling down. But I always loved the sort of bravery of those club kids and the fact that they use fashion for provocation and for confrontation and to articulate really sort of meaningful concepts about race and ethnicity and about gender and sexuality. So my way into fashion was very much through the club kids from the 80s in London. They were these heroes of mine, and I just thought they were extraordinary.
It seems like you always looked at fashion with an anthropologist kind of eye.
I think initially I tried to be a bit more balanced, but I think my bias is exactly that. I think my bias probably is looking at fashion culturally, but also artistically. I'm always amazed at sometimes the complexity of a John Galliano dress or of an Asinalaya dress or an Issey Miyake dress. I'm always marveling at the sort of artistry of fashion. So I try to strike a balance between really focusing on exactly like the artistry, but also a cultural context for it. And I think this one's new for me in a way, because I think what I tried to do for this exhibition was to sort of move the needle of costume studies, not away from, but also towards more of an emotional and sensorial interpretation of fashion. So not just artistic, not just cultural, but also sensorial and emotional.
So there's one sculpture within the exhibition.
It is, yes. It opens the show. It's Brancusi's Sleeping Muse, made out of bronze, and 1910 it dates. And in a way, she's sort of the mascot for the exhibition. So when you first walk into the show, you see Brancusi's Sleeping Muse as this mascot and this sort of emblem and this icon of the exhibition. Yeah.
Tell me about how she became the figurehead.
Well, I mean, I've always loved it. And she belongs to the modern and contemporary department. And the curators very kindly lent it for the duration of the exhibition. It's just the head. The head's actually reclining, lying down. And I felt as if it just really summed up and was the sort of epitome of what the whole exhibition's about, which is this idea of reawakening garments that have been in slumber for sometimes many years and reawakening them. So I felt she was this ultimate sort of symbol for what we were trying to portray in the exhibition.
One thing I was just thinking about was the preponderance of fashion exhibitions at museums in general. Do you ever think, like, what hath I wrought? It seems like kind of like a reactionary to the Costume Institute being such a hit. I just can't go to a museum now without there being like fashion is like 75% of their calendar now, it seems. And do you go to them?
I do go to them, and I love the fact that more and more and more museums are displaying fashion and very differently, often and in very different approaches. I sort of feel, to me, it shows you how central fashion is to our life, so central to the idea of the contemporary. Fashion is one of the most democratic and, in a way, accessible of the art forms. We all wear it. We all have an opinion about it. And I always think about when I go through our galleries, just seeing people's different reactions. You see people in the European Paintings Gallery, and they're much quieter, they're more respectful. It's almost they're afraid of the works on display, whereas in ours, it's a free-for-all. People are laughing, they're joking. There's no inhibitions. They're not afraid to voice an opinion about fashion because they relate to it. Even if it's a garment like an aeroplane dress by Hussein Chalayan that doesn't seem wearable, people can still relate to it. It was designed for the body and was designed to be worn on the body, no matter how extreme it is. So I love it. I love the fact that it just shows you how important fashion is to our lives and how important fashion is to the concept of the contemporary.
You say that you kind of got into fashion in the first place from street style as a kid and stuff. Are you still, affected by the street and like what you see? Is that kind of where the germinations for your ideas for exhibitions come from, is from what you see walking around and just experience in life?
Definitely. Inspiration comes from anywhere. We did a show called Carl Lock about a line of beauty last year. And I happened to be walking through a gallery, first gallery actually, which had a group of fur coats by Lagerfeld. And there was a note on the plinth saying, "Please do not touch." And there was a small girl there, I don't know, she must have been about 9 or 10. And she said to the security guard, "What happens if I touch it?" And the security guard put his hand out and set off this piercing alarm. And I thought, yeah, to a young visitor, clothing is inherently tactile. It's asking to be touched. And so part of the exhibition is also, she's going to be our patron going forward. So part of it is like to sort of look at this museum etiquette that seems so strange to the outside world. And the fact that fashion, more than any other art form, changes its status. More than a painting comes into the museum, you put it on the wall, it's still the same thing, you're still looking at it. But with fashion, it changes so dramatically. It's the fact that fashion touches all of our senses that is the reason why that status is changed so radically. So part of that was really stemming from that young girl. It was so odd for her. And it's like, yeah, it is odd, because in the real world, outside the museum, you can touch it, and you can wear it, you can smell it, you can hear it.
One thing, I don't know if this is factored into the show, but in the catalog, I love the part where you talk about the Scoup, which I learned, which is a portmanteau for scrape and whoop, and as the French call it, frou-frou. And then it goes into the scientific analysis of this. I mean, you really do deep dives.
Yeah, oh my gosh, I love it. I know it sounds like a garage band, doesn't it? But exactly what you said, a combination of scrape and whoop. And it's the sound of silk, basically. Taffeta has the loudest screw because it's finished in a particular way that makes it crisper. And in the 19th century, you would see adverts. The louder the screw, the louder the noise, the more expensive it was. So screw was a term that was marketed in the 19th century. And I've always been fascinated by the sound of fashion. I was always struck that when you would read novels by people like Henry James or Edith Wharton, they would invariably discuss the sound of fashion rather than the dress itself. So the idea of a ball gown scraping against a piece of furniture, or the train trailing on the floor. And they would talk about it so beautifully. The idea of sound is so pivotal to our understanding of fashion. And also it's so sensual as well. So women in the 18th and 19th century, there was an etiquette around sound, in terms of how you can make yourself louder or softer, depending on what you wanted to do. It was part of the art of seduction, was the idea of sound. and particularly in the 18th century. So I wanted to explore that. So we actually did a replica of the dress, and we found some taffeta that was a match to the 1770s dress that we have. Then we took it to an anechoic chamber at Birmingham University and we recorded it. An anechoic chamber is a room that has no sound. So you're hearing Scoup in its purest form. So it's much louder. It sounds like white noise. It's unadulterated Scoup. No interference of echoes or electromagnetic waves.
It's just amazing that you can go to Berlin to get birds. You can go to anechoic chambers to record Scoup. That, you have license to do all these things. It's amazing. I'm very excited for this exhibition. You've done so many exhibitions now. It's like, does this stand out to you, like especially personal or special to you? This seems like a very big undertaking, even amongst all the big undertakings you've already done there.
Every show I do, I have such a personal connection to. This one, I think, especially so, because I think it's the first time we've shown all of the skills and expertise of my colleagues in the department. You don't see it. You don't see how incredible our installation manager dresses a mannequin, or how extraordinary our conservators conserve and preserve garments, or how careful and again skilled one of our collection teams actually lay out fashion. So I think the reason why I'm so connected to it is it really does show all of the people behind this exhibition, all of their extraordinary skill sets, and how it literally takes a village to put on one of our shows, literally. But it's spotlighting our conservators, it's spotlighting our collections team, it's spotlighting our installation manager, as well as the curatorial team, which is also large. So it's a truly collaborative effort, and they always are. But this one, I feel you can see the collaboration, you can see the people behind it. And the previous shows, it's more invisible because it's done so quietly. We're loudly proclaiming and showing off the people we have in our department.
Also connected to this kind of conversing between the centuries is the section on yellow, and it has dresses where it's like they're kind of similar. One will be hundreds of years apart. The connection is an ancient dye technique. I was completely unaware of this.
That section is part of what we're calling the garden room. And basically, it's really a history of fashion through yellow and the changing silhouettes of fashion. And the reason we chose yellow was because it's actually one of the few plants that creates a dye that is the same color as the flower that it produces. It's a plant called the world plant, and it produces bright yellow flower. And in the 18th and 19th century, it was used to create yellow dyes before the introduction of aniline dyes in the mid-19th century. So there's 15 pieces. And when you look at it, you go from the 1740s, there's changing silhouettes in yellow, and then you end up with a contemporary piece by Phoebe English, actually, from 2023. But what's interesting is that, it shows you the usage of natural dyes in the 18th and 19th century. It shows you the introduction of aniline dyes. And again, there's not much difference in terms of the color. But we end with Phoebe English, who is, again, working with weld to create yellow. So there's a new generation of designers who are working with natural dyes, and one of which is weld. So it sort of comes full circle. You start off with weld and you end with weld. But throughout the whole journey, you're seeing the history of fashion through 300 years.
It's interesting also just yellow as a narrative. I would immediately jump to purple, because it's the color of royalty. Yellow is a real curveball for me. So go yellow.
I think also yellow is so contradictory as a color. You can go from like muddy yellow to bright yellow, and it can be seen as something that is depressing to happy. So it's a very emotional color, I think.
As you said, the figurehead is the Brancusi sculpture. Is there some kind of quintessential dress or item that you think really encapsulates this exhibition and that stands out?
I think it's probably the Sleeping Beauties, these really poetic garments that are too fragile to display on mannequins, but we've found a way to display them beautifully. But probably the one that I probably gravitate to is actually one that really was one of the inspirations for the exhibition, which is a dress by Charles Frederick Worth, dates to about 1888. And it was donated by Carrie Astor, who was a daughter of the Mrs. Astor, famous 400 Club. And it's an extraordinary tour de force of the haute couture. Charles Frederick Worth was the father of the haute couture. And it has these clouds and these sunbeams as part of the iconography, but it's suffering from something called warp loss. Warp loss is, again, an inherent vice that affects satin, where the vertical threads, which are the warp threads, are deteriorating because they're very fine. And the horizontal threads, which is the web threads, have remained. So it's completely fracturing as a garment. It looks like angel hair. When you look at it, it's like child's hair. It's so beautiful to look at, but there's nothing we can do to rectify it. It will continue and continue to fracture and to deteriorate. And we actually brought that one back to life through Pepper's Ghost. So what I was keen to do, and I initially had the idea to do that for all the Sleeping Beauties, but there was no time because this one actually took 9 months to actually recreate. The process of bringing her back to life in terms of showing her on a three-dimensional body and showing her in movement involved having to do a pattern initially, and then digitizing the pattern, then doing 3D scans of the embroidery, then putting it to the computer and getting the materiality correct, because we had the satin and the chiffon, and seeing how it moves. It literally took 9 months to get to where we are. After you get past the Sleeping Muse, the first gallery you come to is Charles Frederick Worth, the Sleeping Beauty of the exhibition. And in front of her is this Pepper's Ghost or hologram that's brought her back to life. So I think that one probably, because it was one of the inspirations for the exhibition.
You've been telling stories through garments and clothes. It seems like you're just as excited as you were. Is this never ending for you? Are you still just as excited as you were before? And that there's just still so many ideas left?
Absolutely. I think that's what's so nice about art in general, but fashion in particular, because there are so many stories to tell and different angles to tell. What I said earlier about that one dress, Venus, we've had her out 9 times. She was in 9 different shows. That one was about the hand and the machine. This one's about the sense. So she's brought back to life so many times just through how we interpret it and how we perceive it. And I love that about it. And I love that about museums. You know, sometimes you can walk past a sculpture you've seen for 10 years and suddenly the light captures it in a way that you haven't seen before. And then suddenly it comes to life and you see it through different eyes. And I love the fact that objects have this affecting presence that can really move you depending on your state of mind and depending on the time of the day or whatever. So yeah, I believe objects have an affecting presence. They have these inherent rhetorical power to move you. So yeah, I'm never tired of it.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for joining us on the Art Angle today, Andrew.
Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
That's it for this week's episode. If you like what you heard, you can subscribe to the show on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever else you get your podcasts. Also, take a moment to rate and review us. It will help other listeners discover what we're doing. The Art Angle is produced by Sonia Manalili and Caroline Goldstein. Thanks for listening and see you next week.